Hey, Mark, I'm Jim. And I thought that rather than put a long TLDR together that someone wouldn't read, I would answer your question with a little video, and that way it can be reused for other people. So, the question that you had is, as a newbie member and a newbie question, is it better to practice on the same guitar as you progress, or is it okay to bounce back and forth between two or three guitars? So there's an old saying, and the saying goes like this: beware the man with one gun. He knows how to use it. Now, having grown up in a rural area where guns are the norm, I get what that's saying. One of my family could drop a buck with a rifle that would shock the city people that would come through. And they would say, how can you do that? Well, it's because we knew every pro and every con that one of our guns had, and we were good with them. And that way, when it came time to use them, those particular guns had so many hours put into them that you could do anything from a squirrel to a buck and have a very similar result because you knew how to use the gun and how that bullet was going to go. Now, moving that into guitars, which is obviously what we're talking about here, or any instrument for that matter, there's nothing wrong with going from guitar to guitar. But ask yourself, do pianists go from piano to piano? Of course they do. They go from upright to concert to whatever. But notice the thing that's the same is the interface between them and the piano, is the keys, right? So as long as they have realistic keys that they can use the same way each time, and I'm not saying that they will always be the same, there will be little differences. So it's always a good idea to use the same piano over and over and over. Same with drummers. Drummers tend to set their drums up, even if they're using someone else's kit, the same way each time. So let's go to guitar. And because you're new to the instrument, there's some things that a lot of people don't think about. The folks who have been doing it a long time, the Steve Steins, and folks like that, they do it so effortlessly. And you say, well, of course they do. Of course they do. Right? So how is it that that can be accomplished, or should it be? And really, it's okay so long as you have, number one, a good grasp of what's the difference in the guitars, and number two, why. And I think we'll look at number two after we look at number one. So let's look at number one first here. What's the difference in the guitars? Sometimes it's the output level, right? One guitar is weaker than the other. One guitar is tinnier than the other. One guitar has a yellow top. I'm starting to run out of things. So those are things that come up, but there's things that we do that are responses that we do sometimes subconsciously. And then there are physical differences in the guitars. Telecasters, or Fenders in general, Gibsons in general, PRSs in general, Ibanez, Jackson, so on and so forth. And the reason I bring those up is because there are some things that change. The scale length changes. And you think, well, it's only a quarter of an inch, or half an inch, or an inch. The problem is that when you make those changes, it changes the way that your fingers spread out as you move up and down the fretboard. And if that occurs, Then what happens is you start to have to subconsciously move your fingers open for one guitar and move them closed for another. That awareness should be there when you're doing that. So Fender guitars, the scale is wider for the most part. There are shorter scale Fenders. The Jaguar comes to mind. And for Gibsons, that distance is a little shorter. For PRS, they were going for the Goldilocks thing. It's right in the middle. Most PRSs. And then there's a thing called the radius. You'll have compound radius. You'll have 10-inch radius. You have 12-inch radius. You have 9.5-inch radius. 7.25-inch radius. What's the difference there? Well, the difference is how it reacts whenever you get out of the first few frets. Really, when you're playing cowboy chords, if you're doing just cowboy chords and open stuff, it doesn't really matter. Not a lot. It's when you start moving out of there. So what are those differences? Well, in the radius, it's when you start bending notes, especially in the upper frets, with a 7.25-inch radius versus a 12-inch radius, which is a Gibson standard. An early Fender standard is 7.25. The new PRS SE Silver Sky, which I have in the other room for some reason, that's 8.5-inch radius. And then there's 9.5-inch radius for a lot of Fenders, and there's 10-inch radius. And those differences are in the way that you're going to bend. These are all things you should be conscious of. These are physical differences. The way the guitar sits around your neck. Are you standing? Are you sitting? Are you a little heavy? Are you a light, skinny person? Are you tall? Are you short? How long are your fingers? All of those things matter. How strong are your fingers? What gauge strings do you have on there? All those things change. And because those physicalities change, you're introducing variables you have to overcome each time you play another instrument. It doesn't mean you shouldn't, but it also, just because you can, doesn't mean you should. It's a good idea in the beginning to learn on a single instrument and then move into new instruments. We are in a glut of instruments. We're in a state of where there's so many instruments. I play regularly, and I'm not a professional, but I do play regularly. And I think I have like 12 or 15 guitars total. Seems like a lot to some people. Doesn't seem like a lot to others. But my point is, most of them have Gibson headstocks on them. And so most of them feel the same. There are differences that I have to overcome because the 335, and that's what I'm going to start getting at beyond the physical differences. A 335 won't be exactly the same as a Les Paul. And a Les Paul Custom isn't the same as a Les Paul Standard. There are differences, little differences in the feel. But notice that I've got 3 Les Pauls. I'm trying to stay right there. But there are differences in them. One has a compound fretboard, that gold top. So that means that I have a different radius at the nut than I do coming towards the 20th fret. So those things I have to think about. And I have to figure out how I'm going to play it, set it up. It feels different, completely different. So why don't I play Fenders more, you might ask? Well, to be honest with you, that's where that subjective, unconscious difference comes in. So sometimes I'll play different Les Pauls because I want a different color. Honestly, I'm not going to lie to somebody. I'll say, well, I'm kind of feeling the tuxedo look tonight. So there's the custom. Or I'm kind of feeling, my standard way of feeling. That's definitely the Les Paul over my shoulder here. And then there's times I feel a little bit different and I want the gold top. But they all sound different. And they all have a different voice. So I kind of want to take this out of guitar for just a second. Let's say you're driving down the road. Favorite song comes on. And you start singing to it. But the radio isn't really turned. So you crank it. And then you're like singing at the top of your lungs. Yeah, this sounds so good. And then your buddy calls you on your way to wherever you're going. And, hey, man, let's go to karaoke. You know what? That sounds great. And you go there. And you're like, man, I was just singing this song in the car. And I sounded so good. I sounded awesome. I'm going to sing this at karaoke. So you put that song in at karaoke and you find out it wasn't as easy as you thought it was. And why? There's a subconscious thing that happens when most people sing along with something. So they turn up the original singer, and really what their ears are really what their ears are hearing is the original singer and not themselves. And there's what little of themselves they're hearing is blended with that original singer. So therefore, what they get isn't what they would sound like. It's what they would sound like if they were standing next to the original singer, singing the song the way they sang it the first time. So it's a letdown if they record themselves and they aren't drunk when they hear it back. What's my point? My point is, when you get back to guitars, we can sit down and we can play sometimes in a tube, in a vacuum. And, oh, that sounds just like AC/DC. And then you turn on the AC/DC album and you go, that does not sound like AC/DC at all. Because if you take a backing track and you start to play with it, you go, oh my God, there's something missing. Whether it's high end, low end, peaks, valleys, whatever. So where am I going with this? Well, a Fender will respond differently from the Les Paul. So let's go back into the car when you were singing along with that song. And you were like, oh my God, I'm going to sing. But you turned it up. A Fender guitar is not as powerful as a Les Paul. And because of that, you're going to feel something different. Whether it's you think you've got to hit it harder because it's not as loud, it doesn't give as much punch to things, or you turn it way up. Then you get the Les Paul and you're like, oh, that Les Paul sounds terrible. I can't stand it. It's too powerful. And what happens then is there's this bias that starts to build. It's the bias I have for Fenders, that I have to have a whole different setup to play a Fender style guitar or PRS to get, or my Gibsons. Everything has to be set differently, because everything from your guitar to your pedals, whether you have them or not, to your amplifier or whatever you're listening through, all of that thing is an ecosystem. So think of it like you have a iPhone, and then you have a PC, and they don't communicate well. So you have a Gibson guitar and whatever pedals. A lot of fuzz pedals are made for single coils. Most of them work better with single coils than they do with a humbucker. So there's that. And then people go, well, I've got this Fender, sounds kind of wimpy. I'm going to put a humbucker in the bridge. Well, now you have a single hum, which some people love, but it's, now you've got to fight with the fact that you have kind of two guitars in one, because you have a wimpier guitar and a more powerful guitar. Well, I can split the coil. Well, then what's the point of having the humbucker? Well, so I can have a boost. And then that's what pedals are for, right? Or that's what different setups are for. So Those are all things you have to think about. These are unconscious things. We don't always think about up here until we have to solve the problem. And so go back to karaoke. You get into karaoke night and you're like, what could I do? What could I have done to sound better? Well, I could have practiced. I could have put some work into that song because I liked it and I liked singing it. But the playback didn't give me anything. So I could go home and I could record myself and I could play it back. And I could go, I could fix that. I can work on that. A lot of people, and I'm going to sound like I'm bragging, but I don't care. When I get done singing, they'll say, how do you do that? How do you reach those notes? How do you? I said, well, it came from hours sitting by myself in front of a crappy little, I had a Radio Shack microphone sitting in a lamp between two speakers, and I would sing my heart out into that microphone with those speakers until the music was turned way down low, and people would say, I can't tell the difference between you and the original singer. And the fact was that I had the music turned down low enough, they couldn't hear the original singer. It was me. And it was kind of the same thing. To be honest, if you turned it back up, you'd hear the difference. I obviously don't sound like everybody else, and I'm not trying to sound like other people. But I was able to emote and bring the notes together to make that happen. Same thing with guitar. I actually turned the other music down and my guitar up. I want to hear it. And so it's actually something that's difficult for me because I'll be on stage and I'll go to play, and if I can't hear myself, I really can't play. I have to hear it. I have to be able to hear that amplifier playing back to me. So why? Why do you want to play different guitars? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Is it because you're bored and you just want to move to the other guitar? Be honest with yourself, though. I'm not trying to say that any of these things that I'm about to say are the reasons. You need to be the only person that has to answer it to yourself. Why do you want to switch guitars? Is it because you feel that you like the color? Is it because your friends are playing Telecasters? It's because the original was on a Telecaster? Or a Les Paul or a Stratocaster or whatever? Is it because you saw a bunch of people in some cool videos with Harley Bentons and you have to get a Harley Benton and add that to your collection? And because you have the Harley Benton, you feel you have to play it? Those are things you have to answer for yourself. The why you're switching. And if the reason is not because it has to be done, then why do it? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. If you're really good and you're flying through the stuff and now that guitar that you have isn't giving you what you can do, that's when bouncing back and forth really helps. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons to play acoustic and electric and so on and so forth. But the fact is that you should be, number one, aware of the physical differences. Number two, be aware of those things that are subconscious differences and be able to combine those into the style and the way you're playing and how you express and emote yourself so that you become the player you want to be. I hope that helps.